What if the perfect life you thought you had was nothing more than a gilded cage, and the man you loved was the one holding the key? For Charlotte, Peterson life was a fairy tale. She was married to the handsome, charismatic millionaire Richard Davenport and pregnant with their first child. But at their own lavish charity gala in front of New York's elite, Richard shattered the illusion with just 3 words aimed at his heavily pregnant wife. As Charlotte fled, her world crumbling, a young waiter caught her arm. He didn't offer a glass of water or a kind platitude. He leaned in and whispered a secret, not about Charlotte, but about her husband. A secret so explosive it would ignite a chain of events that would expose a lie years in the making and change all of their lives forever. The chandeliers of the Davenport estate dripped crystal light, casting a diamond-like shimmer over the sea of tuxedos and couture gowns. It was the annual Davenport Foundation charity gala, the crown jewel of the Manhattan social calendar, and Charlotte Davenport, née Peterson, felt like an imposter in her own home. At 7 months pregnant, she felt less like a graceful hostess and more like a small barge navigating a treacherous harbor. Her custom-made sapphire silk gown, meant to be elegant, felt restrictive, and her swollen ankles protested in their designer heels. Her husband, Richard Davenport, moved through the crowd with the predatory grace of a panther. He was all sharp angles and blindingly white smiles. His handshakes firm, his laughter echoing with the confidence of a man who had never known a day of want. He was the heir to the Davenport shipping fortune, a legacy he had expertly pivoted into global logistics and tech investments. To the world, he was brilliant, generous, and utterly devoted to his lovely wife. Charlotte knew the truth was more complicated. The Richard she had fallen in love with, the funny, slightly awkward man who'd stumbled over his words asking her out after a chance meeting at a coffee shop, had slowly been replaced by this polished, untouchable figure. The deeper she was drawn into his world of old money and unspoken rules, the more the man she loved receded, replaced by the Davenport heir. His mother, Eleanor Davenport, a woman who seemed to be carved from Arctic ice, was holding court near the grand fireplace. Her eyes, the same piercing blue as her son's, swept over Charlotte, and the subtle downturn of her lips was a familiar critique. In Eleanor's eyes, Charlotte, the daughter of a Midwestern high school principal, would never be anything more than a pretty, but ultimately common accessory for her son. The pregnancy, which should have been a bridge between them, had only widened the chasm. Eleanor had made it clear she expected a male heir, a true Davenport, to carry on the name. The fact they were having a girl was a disappointment Charlotte was made to feel daily. "Darling," Richard's voice, smooth as velvet, cut through her thoughts. He appeared at her side, his arm sliding possessively around her waist. He smelled of expensive cologne and single malt scotch. "Jeffrey Price is here. I want you to be charming." Jeffrey Price was Richard's primary business rival, a self-made tech billionaire with a reputation for ruthless acquisitions. Their presence together was a carefully orchestrated performance of civility for the benefit of the press and their shareholders. "Of course, Richard," Charlotte said, forcing a smile. She followed him towards Jeffrey, her steps feeling heavy and clumsy. As they approached, her foot caught on the edge of a Persian rug. She stumbled, lurching forward with a small, undignified gasp. She didn't fall, but a tray of champagne flutes, held by a passing waiter, clattered to the floor as he jumped back to avoid her. The music seemed to dip. 100 pairs of eyes turned towards the sound towards her. A flush of hot, deep shame crawled up her neck. She could feel Eleanor's gaze boring into her back. Richard's hand tightened on her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. He leaned in close, his voice a low, venomous hiss meant only for her, yet in the sudden lull it carried. For God's sake, Charlotte, could you be any more embarrassing? The words struck her with the physical force of a slap. Embarrassing. In front of everyone. In front of his rival, his mother, their friends. It wasn't just the word. It was the contempt dripping from it, the final confirmation of a fear she'd been nursing for months, that she was a liability, a blemish on his perfect life. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and immediate. She pulled her arm from his grasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice thick. She turned and fled, not looking back, pushing through the stunned clusters of guests. Their whispers followed her like the rustling of dry leaves. She didn't head for the grand staircase or their private wing. She needed air. She pushed open the French doors leading to the west terrace, the cool night air, a welcome shock to her heated skin. The manicured gardens stretched out below, illuminated by soft, strategic lighting. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a cold and indifferent witness. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She leaned against the cold stone balustrade, one hand protectively cradling her belly, and finally let the tears fall. He hadn't even looked at her with concern, only disgust. "Ma'am, Mrs. Davenport." The voice was quiet, respectful. She turned hastily, wiping her eyes. It was one of the waiters, a young man with dark, kind eyes and a neatly pressed uniform. He was holding a glass of water. He looked to be in his early 20s, with a serious but gentle expression. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her voice betraying a sob. "I don't think you are," he said softly. He stepped closer out of the direct line of sight from the ballroom. "I heard what he said." Charlotte flinched, another wave of humiliation washing over her. "Please just leave me be." "I'm sorry, I can't," he said, his voice dropping even lower. He glanced back towards the party, then leaned in his expression urgent. "My name is Leo Martinez. We haven't met, but I need to tell you something." She stared at him, confused. "Tell me what?" He took a deep breath, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that startled her. He wasn't just offering sympathy. This was something else entirely. "What your husband did in there. It wasn't just cruelty." Leo whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant music. "It was a diversion. He's panicking. I know what he's really hiding, Mrs. Davenport. It's bigger than you can imagine. It's about a project called Viridian Dynamics." The name meant nothing to her. She shook her head, bewildered. I don't understand." "You don't have to understand right now," he said, pressing the glass of water into her hand. "Just know that his anger at you isn't about you. It's about fear. Be careful. And if you want to know the truth, meet me tomorrow. 2:00, the cafe on the corner of Lex and 77th. The Daily Grind. Please, it's important." Before she could respond, he gave a slight formal bow and melted back into the shadows, disappearing through a service door. Charlotte was left standing alone on the terrace, the cold glass in her hand, the name Viridian Dynamics echoing in her mind, and a chilling new emotion creeping in, alongside the hurt and shame, a sliver of terrifying curiosity. The whisper on the terrace hadn't mended her broken heart, but it had just armed her with a question that might save her life. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow apologies. Charlotte eventually composed herself, reapplying her makeup with trembling hands in a deserted powder room, before re-emerging onto the battlefield of the gala. Richard found her, his demeanor once again impeccably smooth, as if the incident on the terrace had never happened. He made a public show of concern, placing a hand on the small of her back and guiding her through the thinning crowd, his touch feeling more like a brand than a comfort. When the last guest had finally departed and the catering staff were quietly clearing the debris of the night's festivities, the silence of the vast mansion became oppressive. Richard loosened his bow tie, his back to her, as he poured 2 fingers of scotch at the bar in their private library. "You really made a scene tonight, Charlotte," he said, his voice flat. Charlotte's shock had finally subsided, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of anger. "I made a scene. You humiliated me, Richard. You called me an embarrassment in front of our guests, in front of Geoffrey Price." He turned, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a weary annoyance. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. You were clumsy. You drew attention. I simply reacted. You're far too sensitive." It was his classic move, gaslighting. He would twist reality until she questioned her own sanity, making her emotions the problem rather than his actions. It had worked countless times before, chipping away at her confidence until she was the one apologizing. But tonight was different. Leo's whisper had planted a seed of doubt. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a diversion. "I'm carrying your child, Richard," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and hurt. "My body isn't my own right now. I'm tired, I'm swollen, and I stumbled. A husband should offer a hand, not an insult." "A Davenport is never clumsy," he retorted, his voice sharp as broken glass. "My mother was appalled. You need to get a handle on yourself. This whole pregnancy has made you emotional." He took a long swallow of his drink, his gaze dismissive. The conversation was over in his mind. But for Charlotte, it was just beginning. The name Leo had whispered echoed in her head. Viridian dynamics. She lay awake for hours that night in their cold, cavernous bedroom, the space between her and Richard in the king-sized bed feeling like a mile-wide canyon. His steady breathing was a maddening rhythm in the dark. She thought about Leo Martinez. He was just a waiter, a caterer. How could he possibly know anything about Richard's business? It was absurd. He was probably a crank, a gossip looking to stir up trouble. And yet, his eyes, there had been a desperate sincerity in them. "He's panicking." Richard had seemed on edge all night, his charm stretched a little too tight, his smile a little too fixed even before her stumble. His outburst had been disproportionate, savage. Maybe it was a diversion. The next day, she called in sick to the one thing that was truly hers. Her volunteer position on the board of a children's literacy charity. She told Richard she was feeling unwell from the previous night, an excuse he readily accepted, too preoccupied with a series of curt, agitated phone calls in his study. At 1:30, her heart pounding, she put on a simple dress, sunglasses, and a wide-brimmed hat, feeling like a spy in a B-movie. She took a taxi, not the town car, and had it drop her 2 blocks away from the designated cafe. The Daily Grind was a small, unassuming place, a world away from the polished chrome and marble cafes she frequented with Richard's circle. It smelled of real coffee and burnt sugar. She scanned the tables, her anxiety mounting. What was she even doing here? She saw him in a booth at the back. Leo Martinez. Out of his uniform, he looked even younger, dressed in a worn university sweatshirt and jeans, a stack of textbooks on the table beside him. He saw her, and a look of profound relief washed over his face. "Mrs. Davenport." Thank you for coming, he said, as she slid into the booth opposite him. Call me Charlotte, she said, her voice barely a whisper. What is this about? Who are you? My name is Leo Martinez. He began, his hands clasped on the table. And I'm not really a waiter. I mean, I am. It's how I pay my bills. But I'm a student at Columbia. I'm in my final year of the investigative journalism program. This was a surprise. An aspiring journalist. It made a strange kind of sense. For my thesis project, I decided to investigate greenwashing by major corporations. He continued, his words coming out in a rush. Companies that publicly promote eco-friendly initiatives while their actual practices are harmful or fraudulent. Davenport Logistics came onto my radar 6 months ago. Charlotte felt a chill despite the warmth of the cafe. Richard's company. But his green initiatives are famous. The Clean Ports program, the electric truck fleet. Leo shook his head grimly. That's the window dressing. The real money, the real focus of his new venture capital arm, is a company called Viridian Dynamics. He's been pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into it. I've never heard of it. Charlotte confessed, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. You wouldn't have. It's a private subsidiary. On paper, Viridian Dynamics is developing a revolutionary technology for carbon capture, a way to literally pull pollution out of the air. It's the holy grail of green tech. Richard used the promise of this technology to secure a massive co-investment from Jeffrey Price's firm. That deal was what last night was all about. It was finalized right after you went upstairs. So it sounds innovative, Charlotte said, though her own words sounded weak. Leo leaned forward, his voice dropping. That's the point, Charlotte. It's too innovative. It's science fiction. I've spoken to 3 different MIT chemical engineers off the record. They all say the technology, as Viridian's patents describe it, is scientifically impossible with our current understanding of physics. It's a ghost, a shell. A shell for what? She breathed. I don't know for sure, he admitted. But my source, a mid-level accountant inside your husband's company, started feeding me documents. Invoices, shipping, manifests, wire transfers. The money being funneled into Viridian isn't going to research and development. It's being routed through a series of offshore accounts and then used to purchase defunct industrial sites. Contaminated land, old chemical plants, mostly in developing countries. The coffee she had ordered sat untouched. Why? Why buy toxic land? I don't know the end game, Leo said, his frustration evident. But it's a massive fraud. Richard is either scamming Jeffrey Price out of hundreds of millions, or they're in on it together. My source believed the former. He thought Richard was in over his head, being manipulated by someone. He said Richard has been acting erratically for months, terrified of being exposed. Your source? Charlotte asked, seizing on the detail. Can he prove this? Leo's face fell. He was supposed to send me the final piece of the puzzle 2 weeks ago, the key that connected Viridian's spending to a specific illegal activity. But he went silent. His phone is disconnected. His email bounces back. He's vanished. The word hung in the air between them. Vanished. Last night. Leo concluded, his gaze intense. Richard was on a razor's edge. He had to close that deal with Price. Any little thing that went wrong, a question from a journalist, a skeptical investor, a wife making a scene, could have spooked Price and blown the whole thing up. When you stumbled, he didn't see his pregnant wife. He saw a threat. He snapped. His cruelty was a symptom of his terror. Charlotte sat back, the worn vinyl of the booth sticking to her skin. Her mind was reeling. Richard, a fraud. A criminal. It seemed impossible. He was meticulous, obsessed with control and reputation. But it also explained so much: his recent paranoia, his obsession with appearances, his violent reaction to a minor mishap. "Why tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why risk this?" "Because my source is gone, and I'm hitting a wall," Leo said, his honesty disarming. "And because I saw his face when he looked at you last night. No one deserves that. I also know that you live there. You have access I could only dream of. The proof I need. The proof that could protect you and blow this whole thing open is probably on a computer or in a file in that house." He was asking her to spy on her own husband, the father of her unborn child. She looked at this young, earnest student who was risking his future on a story, on a hunch. Then she thought of Richard's cold eyes, his dismissive words, the casual cruelty that had become their new normal. She thought of her daughter growing up in a house built on lies, with a father who valued perfection over people. "What do you need?" Charlotte asked. And in that moment, the fairy tale ended, and the fight for her life began. Returning to the Davenport mansion felt like stepping onto a hostile alien planet. The familiar polished mahogany and gleaming marble now seemed to mock her silent accomplices in a grand deception. Every portrait of a stern-faced Davenport ancestor felt like a judging eye. Her home had become the headquarters of the man she was investigating. The first step was the most terrifying: gaining access to Richard's office. It was his sanctuary, a state-of-the-art fortress of technology and privacy. He was notoriously paranoid about security, and the office was protected by a biometric fingerprint scanner. A scanner that only recognized his thumbprint, and as a concession to his role as master of the house, the thumbprint of his mother, Eleanor. Charlotte had never been granted access. Her opportunity came 2 days later. Richard announced he would be flying to London for a 48-hour trip to meet with their European logistics partners. The official reason was business as usual. The real reason, Charlotte now suspected, was to manage the fallout, or the next steps of the Viridian scheme. The night he left, Charlotte waited until the house fell into a deep, echoing silence. Even the servants had retired to their quarters. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the thick oak door of his study. She had a plan, one that felt both ingenious and insane. Last Christmas, as a novelty gift, she had given Richard a set of highball whiskey glasses, each etched with a D and his monogram. He used one almost every night, including the night he left. After he'd gone, she'd carefully retrieved the glass from the library, handling it only by the rim. Using a small pouch of fingerprinting powder she'd ordered from a forensic supply website, a purchase that made her feel utterly ridiculous, she dusted the glass. Under the dim light, a perfect clear thumbprint emerged, whorls and all. She photographed it with her phone, inverted the colors on a photo editing app, and printed it onto a piece of transparent acetate. The next step was the stuff of spy movies she'd once scoffed at. Following a tutorial she'd found in the deep recesses of the internet, she dripped a small amount of wood glue onto the printed fingerprint, letting it spread and dry. After an hour, she carefully peeled it off. She was left with a thin, flexible film bearing a perfect raised replica of Richard's thumbprint. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the film. This was it. This was an act of overt betrayal. There was no going back. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pressed the fake thumbprint against the glowing red sensor. The light flickered green. A soft click echoed in the silent hallway. The door was unlocked. A wave of adrenaline and nausea washed over her. She slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The room smelled of leather and Richard's cologne. It was dark, save for the glow of multiple monitors on his massive desk. She powered on his main desktop computer. Another security barrier, a password. She tried the obvious first. Their anniversary, his birthday, his mother's name. Nothing. She thought about his obsession with legacy with the Davenport name. She typed in the name of the first ship his great-grandfather had ever owned, the Dauntless. The screen blinked and the desktop loaded. She was in. She felt a moment of triumph quickly replaced by overwhelming dread. Now what? She wasn't a hacker. She was a literature major who volunteered at a children's charity. Leo's words guided her. Viridian dynamics, offshore accounts, defunct industrial sites. She started with the search bar. Typing Viridian brought up dozens of files. Most were password-protected financial models and encrypted legal documents. She was about to give up when she saw a folder with a simple innocuous name, Project V, Personal Notes. It wasn't encrypted. She clicked it open. It was a series of personal logs, almost like a diary written by Richard. Her blood ran cold as she began to read. October 12th. Spoke with GP today. He's pushing the timeline. Insists the acquisition of the Marinca site in Bulgaria must be finalized before the Q4 board meeting. He doesn't understand the risk, the exposure. He just sees the money. It's my name on the line. My legacy. November 3rd. The Viridian demonstration for Price's tech team was a success. A complete dog and pony show. The prototype we showed them does nothing more than filter air through a fancy HEPA filter and blow out steam. They bought it. Price is ready to wire the first tranche. Sometimes I'm amazed at the sheer arrogance of these new money vultures. They want to believe in miracles. December the 9th. Another transfer to Ethelred Holdings. The shell is working perfectly. The money vanishes in the Cayman Islands and reappears as clean investment capital for the land purchases. It's almost elegant in its depravity. Mother would be horrified if she knew. Or would she? She cares about the Davenport name above all else. This is protecting it in its own twisted way. Charlotte's hands flew to her mouth. It was all true. GP had to be Geoffrey Price. But the logs suggested something different from what Leo suspected. Richard wasn't scamming Geoffrey. He was complaining about him being pushed by him. And what was Ethelred Holdings? She opened a new search tab and typed Ethelred Holdings. The results were sparse, a registered corporation in the Cayman Islands with no listed officers. A ghost. But then she tried a different search, Geoffrey Price, and Ethelred. She found it. A single article from a small financial blog from 5 years prior. It detailed Geoffrey Price's hostile takeover of a smaller tech firm. In the fine print of the acquisition, a holding company was mentioned as a temporary vessel for the shares Ethelred Holdings. It was Geoffrey's shell company. The pieces started to click into place, forming a picture far uglier than she had imagined. Richard wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn. Geoffrey Price was using Viridian dynamics not to be scammed, but as a mechanism to launder money, his money. He would invest his clean money into the fake tech company. Richard would route it through the offshore shell and then use it to buy worthless, polluted land. But why? What was the purpose of buying toxic waste sites? Her eyes fell on another file in the personal notes folder. It was a scanned document, a single page. The letterhead was from the Environmental Protection Agency. It was a draft of a new proposed regulation, the Comprehensive Environmental Restoration Act. The document outlined a massive government subsidy program, offering billions of dollars to corporations willing to take on the cleanup of designated Superfund sites, the most toxic industrial locations in the country. If the bill passed, anyone owning those sites could essentially get paid a fortune by the government to clean up a mess they didn't even make. The draft was dated 2 years ago. At the bottom, a handwritten note, courtesy of Senator Morrison. He assures me it's on the fast track for the next legislative session. Our man in Washington delivers. Jeffrey Price wasn't just committing fraud. He was engaging in insider trading on a colossal scale, using government information to plan a scheme that would net him billions. And he was using Richard and the venerable Davenport name as his cover. Richard wasn't a predator. He was the vehicle. His company, his reputation, his name were all being used to legitimize a massive criminal conspiracy. Suddenly, a sound from the hallway. A floorboard creaked. Charlotte's blood turned to ice. She slammed the laptop shut, her heart leaping into her throat. Richard wasn't supposed to be back for another day. She scrambled from the chair, her mind racing. Had she been discovered? The doorknob began to turn. She dove behind the enormous leather sofa just as the office door swung open. Peeking through the gap between the sofa and the wall, she saw a figure step into the room. It wasn't Richard. It was his mother, Eleanor Davenport. She was in her silk dressing gown, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, even at this late hour. She didn't turn on the lights. She walked directly to the desk, her movements sure and steady in the gloom. She sat in the chair Charlotte had just vacated, opened the laptop, and with no hesitation, typed in the password. The Dauntless. Charlotte held her breath, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. What was she doing? Eleanor didn't browse files. She navigated directly to a secure email portal that Charlotte hadn't even seen. She typed in a username and password and opened a single email. She read it, her face illuminated by the screen's glow, her expression grim and unreadable. Then she typed a short, curt reply. When she was done, she didn't just close the email. She ran a program that Charlotte recognized from tech thrillers, a digital shredder. The program erased the message, then overwrote the data sector to make it permanently irretrievable. Then she closed the laptop, rose from the chair, and left the office, closing and locking the door behind her. She had been in the room for less than 5 minutes. Charlotte remained frozen behind the sofa for a long time, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. Eleanor wasn't just an accessory with access. She was an active participant. She knew. She knew about the passwords. She knew about the secure email she was communicating with someone and covering her tracks. The initial theory that Richard was Jeffrey Price's pawn was suddenly incomplete. A new, more horrifying possibility emerged. What if Richard wasn't the pawn and Jeffrey wasn't the king? What if they were both just pieces on the board being moved by the quiet, icy queen who had just left the room? The matriarch protecting her family's name and fortune by any means necessary. Charlotte crawled out from her hiding place, her body aching with tension. She felt the baby kick a sharp, insistent reminder of the life she was carrying. This was no longer just about Richard's lies. This was a conspiracy that ran deeper and darker than she could have ever conceived, and she and her unborn child were trapped right in the middle of it. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in deception. When Richard returned from London feigning jet lag and complaining about the food, Charlotte played the part of the dutiful, concerned wife. She brought him tea, listened to his fabricated stories about the meetings, and pretended that the chasm between them wasn't now filled with toxic secrets and federal crimes. Every smile was a lie, every touch a performance. The knowledge of what she'd found sat like a lead weight in her stomach. Eleanor was the true shock. The cold, dismissive matriarch was not just a bystander. She was a player. Charlotte watched her at breakfast, observing her crisp, precise movements the way she commanded the room with a mere glance. Was she the mastermind, or just a co-conspirator? Charlotte managed to slip away that afternoon, meeting Leo in a noisy, crowded food court at Grand Central Station, the anonymity of the crowd providing a strange sense of security. She relayed everything she had found: the personal logs, Jeffrey Price's shell company, the EPA document, and finally, Eleanor's clandestine, late-night visit to the office. Leo listened, his expression growing more sober with each revelation. He furiously scribbled notes in a small, worn notebook. "This is bigger than I thought," he said, pushing a hand through his hair. "It's not just corporate fraud. It's a full-blown conspiracy involving government officials. Senator Morrison. He's on the Senate Committee for Energy and Commerce. He'd be in the perfect position to push that legislation through." "But what I don't understand is the dynamic," Charlotte said, twisting a paper napkin in her hands. "Richard's notes make him sound like he's being pressured by Jeffrey. But my mother-in-law's involvement. She despises Jeffrey Price. She sees him as new money vulgar. Why would she be involved in a scheme with him? Unless she isn't," Leo mused, his journalistic instincts kicking in. "What if she's running her own game? What if she knows Richard is being strong-armed by Price, and she's communicating with someone else to try and turn the tables? Or maybe she's the one who orchestrated the whole thing to save a failing Davenport empire. And Richard is just the face of the operation." The possibilities were dizzying, each more terrifying than the last. "I need more, Charlotte," Leo said, his voice firm. "The logs are damning, but they're Richard's personal notes. A good lawyer could dismiss them as fantasy or paranoid ramblings. The EPA document is a smoking gun, but we can't prove how Richard got it. We need something concrete, a recorded conversation, a wire transfer that directly links Ethelred Holdings to Davenport Logistics, the key my source was trying to get me." The thought of trying to record her husband or steal more documents made Charlotte feel physically ill. The stress was taking a toll. She was constantly exhausted, and a dull, persistent ache had settled low in her back. Her doctor, Sophie Chen, had warned her to avoid stress, a laughable instruction under the circumstances. That night, the storm broke. They were having dinner in the small, formal dining room, just Charlotte, Richard, and Eleanor. The tension was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Richard was drinking more than usual, his movements jerky and agitated. Eleanor was a statue of icy composure. "I had a call from Jeffrey Price's office today," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the silence. "His CFO had some questions about the last capital call for Viridian. They're getting nervous." Richard slammed his fork down on his plate. "I told you his people were accountants, not visionaries. They don't understand the timelines for this kind of disruptive tech. I'm handling it." "Are you Richard?" Eleanor's voice was soft, but laced with steel. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Jeffrey is holding the leash. And you're just learning to heal. This was supposed to restore our family's position, not make us a subsidiary of a vulgar upstart." "It's working," Richard hissed, his face flushing with anger and wine. "The plan is working. You wanted the Davenport name to be solvent again, didn't you? This is the price." A sharp pain shot through Charlotte's abdomen, making her gasp. Both Richard and Eleanor turned to look at her, their private war momentarily forgotten. "What is it?" Richard asked, his tone more irritated than concerned. It's nothing, I'm fine, she stammered, but another stronger contraction seized her. It felt like her entire body was being squeezed in a vice. She cried out, clutching her belly. This was not the dull ache from before. This was real. This was happening. The baby, she gasped, her eyes wide with fear. I think it's coming. Panic finally broke through Richard's self-absorbed fury. He shot up from his chair, his eyes wild. Even Eleanor's glacial composure cracked a flicker of alarm in her eyes. The next hour was a chaotic blur of calling the doctor, Richard shouting at the driver, and the surreal experience of being rushed to the hospital with Eleanor, sitting silently in the front seat, her face a mask of grim determination. They placed Charlotte in a private birthing suite at Lenox Hill Hospital. The sterile white room, a stark contrast to the oppressive luxury of the mansion. Nurses and doctors moved in and out, their voices calm and professional, a small island of order in her sea of chaos. Her contractions were coming hard and fast. She was in premature labor. Through the haze of pain and fear, she watched Richard. The anger and arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a man she hadn't seen in years. He was pale, terrified, and utterly lost. He held her hand, his grip clumsy and desperate. He wiped her brow with a cool cloth, his movements uncertain. He looked at the monitors tracking the baby's heartbeat, with a raw fear that was undeniably real. I'm sorry, Lottie, he whispered during a lull between contractions, using a nickname he hadn't used since they were first dating. I'm so sorry. For everything. His apology, coming at this moment of extreme vulnerability, complicated everything. The man she was trying to expose, the criminal, the liar, was also the terrified father of her child, looking at her with genuine remorse in his eyes. Hours later, after a grueling labor, the climax arrived not with an explosion, but with a cry. The first startling cry of a new life. Their daughter was born, small, premature, but breathing on her own. As the nurse placed the tiny, wailing bundle on Charlotte's chest, a wave of love so fierce and protective washed over her that it eclipsed everything else. She looked at her daughter's perfect, scrunched-up face and knew she would burn the world down to keep her safe. Richard stood by the bedside, tears streaming down his face, a broken and humbled man. She's perfect, he sobbed. Later that evening, after the baby had been taken to the NICU for observation, and Charlotte was finally alone in the quiet of her room, he came back in. He sat in the chair by her bed, his expensive suit rumpled, his face etched with exhaustion. We need to talk, he said, his voice hoarse. Charlotte, drained but resolute, looked at him. The love for her daughter had forged her fear into steel. Yes, Richard, we do. What you said about me humiliating you. You were right, he started, his voice cracking. The things I've said, the way I've been, it's monstrous. There's no excuse, but there is a reason. He took a deep breath, looking like a man about to leap from a cliff. The Davenport fortune. It's a myth, Lottie. It's been gone for years. My father made a series of catastrophic investments. He hid it well, but by the time he died, we were leveraged to the hilt. We were drowning. Charlotte listened, her heart pounding. My mother, she couldn't accept it. The shame of it. We were on the verge of ruin. Then Geoffrey Price came to us. He knew about our situation. He's made a career out of sniffing out weakness. He offered a lifeline, an investment, but it came with a price. He looked her straight in the eye, his own filled with self-loathing. Viridian Dynamics was his idea. The whole scheme. The fake tech, the land purchases, the government bill. He said it was the only way to generate enough capital to make us solvent again, quickly and quietly. He wasn't scamming me. He was blackmailing me, using the threat of our financial ruin to force me into being his partner in crime. My name gave him the legitimacy his reputation couldn't buy. And the way you treated me, Charlotte asked, her voice cold. Was that part of his plan, too? No, he said, shaking his head, a fresh wave of shame washing over him. That was all me. I was suffocating. I hated him, but most of all I hated myself. I hated the weakness he saw in me, and I looked at you. So pure, so good, so untainted by all of this, and your pregnancy. It was supposed to be this perfect, happy thing. But my life was a lie. You were a walking, breathing reminder of how badly I had failed, of the filth I was wading in, calling you embarrassing. It was like I was trying to push you away, to tarnish you so you wouldn't be a constant reminder of the man I was supposed to be, but wasn't. It was poison, Lottie. And I'm so sorry. It was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The whole ugly truth. He wasn't a monster. He was a weak man, trapped by pride and circumstance, who had become monstrous. Just then the door opened. It was Eleanor. She was holding a sleek, expensive-looking baby monitor. The nurse said you could watch her from here. She said, her voice softer than Charlotte had ever heard it. She placed the monitor on the bedside table. On the small screen, their daughter slept peacefully in an incubator. Eleanor looked from the monitor to her son, then to Charlotte. Her icy facade seemed to have melted, leaving behind an old, tired woman. He's told you, I gather, she said. It wasn't a question. Charlotte just nodded. Eleanor sighed, a sound like cracking ice. My husband's pride destroyed us. I was determined that my sons would not. I did what I thought was necessary to protect our family, to protect the legacy for her. She glanced at the baby on the screen. I was wrong. I was just as proud and just as foolish. She then looked directly at Charlotte, her blue eyes for the first time holding not judgment, but a plea. Jeffrey Price is a shark who smells blood in the water. He will not stop. He will consume Richard, this family, and everything we have left. The information you now hold, it is the only weapon we have. The question is, Charlotte, what are you going to do with it? The question hung in the sterile hospital room heavier than any threat. The power was no longer with the millionaire, the matriarch, or the shark. It was with her, the woman they had dismissed. And in the NICU down the hall, her tiny, fragile daughter was waiting for an answer. For 2 days, Charlotte existed in the liminal space of the hospital, torn between the overwhelming primal love for her newborn daughter, whom she named Hope, and the colossal decision that lay before her. She watched Richard, who was a constant hovering presence. He was gentle, attentive, and utterly broken. He fed Hope her first bottle through a small opening in the incubator, his large hands trembling as he held the tiny vessel. He spoke to her in hushed, loving tones, promising her a better world, a promise that sounded like both a prayer and a confession. She saw the man he could have been, and it was heartbreaking. She also saw Eleanor, who visited daily. The iron matriarch was gone, replaced by a grandmother who stared at Hope through the plexiglass with a mixture of awe and profound regret. The conspiracy was no longer an abstract financial scheme. It had a tiny sleeping face that represented a future they had all mortgaged. On the third day, Charlotte made her decision. She called Leo Martinez. "I have everything," she said, her voice clear and steady. Richard confessed. He'll cooperate. But I have conditions. The meeting took place not in a sterile boardroom or a clandestine cafe, but in the hospital's quiet, sunlit family lounge. It was a neutral ground. Charlotte sat on a sofa flanked by Richard and Eleanor. Leo sat opposite them, his notebook open, his expression serious. He was no longer just a journalism student. He was the arbiter of their fates. "Here is the deal." Charlotte began, her gaze unwavering. "Richard will give you a full recorded confession. He will detail Jeffrey Price's entire scheme, from the initial blackmail to the insider information from Senator Morrison. He will provide access to every server, every offshore account, every piece of evidence you need to hand this to the SEC and the Department of Justice on a silver platter." Leo nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of her offer. "In exchange for what immunity?" "No." Richard interjected, his voice raspy. "I'm not asking for immunity. I broke the law. I'll face the consequences for my role in this. I want to mitigate the damage to innocent people. My employees. My child." Charlotte picked up where he left off. "Richard will plead guilty to a lesser charge, conspiracy to commit fraud, perhaps. He will be the prosecution's star witness against Jeffrey Price and Senator Morrison. His cooperation should be grounds for a significantly reduced sentence. Community service house arrest, a short term at a minimum security facility. I don't care what it is, as long as it means he will be in his daughter's life." She then turned her gaze to Eleanor. "And she will cooperate fully, as well, detailing her knowledge of the cover-up." Eleanor inclined her head, a silent, dignified assent. "Furthermore," Charlotte continued, her voice hardening, "the Davenport assets will be liquidated. The mansion, the art, the cars, everything. A significant portion will be used to create a restitution fund for any investors harmed by this. The rest will be placed into a legally ironclad, independently managed trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust will be my daughter Hope. Richard and Eleanor will have no control over it. None." It was a complete dismantling of the Davenport empire, a controlled demolition designed not to obliterate, but to rebuild something new and clean from the ashes. "And you, Leo," Charlotte said, looking at the young man who had started it all. "You get the story, the exclusive, the story of a lifetime that will expose Price and a corrupt senator and launch your career into the stratosphere. You just have to tell it right. You have to tell the whole truth, including the part about a man who made a terrible mistake and in the end chose to rectify it." Leo was silent for a long moment, his pen still. He looked from Richard's desperate face to Eleanor's resigned one, and finally to Charlotte's steely resolve. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, I can do that." The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and public disgrace. Leo's story, published in a major national magazine, was an explosive bombshell. The Viridian Ghost, how a tech mirage nearly triggered a financial meltdown, sent shockwaves from Wall Street to Washington, D.C. Jeffrey Price was arrested at his Hamptons estate, his blustering denials crumbling in the face of the overwhelming evidence Richard provided. Senator Morrison resigned in shame before being indicted. The media frenzy was intense, but as promised, Leo's narrative painted Richard not as a master villain, but as a flawed, tragic figure who ultimately chose redemption. His cooperation earned him a plea deal, 18 months in a minimum security federal prison. Eleanor received 2 years of probation. The Davenport name was dragged through the mud, but in the end it stood for something new, a painful public atonement. 1 year later, Charlotte sat on a comfortable sofa in a bright, airy 3-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side. The sun streamed through the large windows, illuminating the happy chaos of toys scattered on the floor. The space was a fraction of the size of the Davenport mansion, but it felt 1,000 times more like a home. In a playpen, 1-year-old Hope stood up, holding onto the railing, and babbled happily. She was a healthy, thriving child, blissfully unaware of the storm she had been born into. Charlotte was no longer Mrs. Davenport. She had taken back her maiden name, Charlotte Peterson. She was a board member of 2 different children's charities, now her work feeling more meaningful than ever. The trust fund ensured her and Hope's financial security, but she was building a life that was entirely her own, on her own terms. She was sorting through the mail when she saw a familiar, elegant handwriting on one of the envelopes. It was from Richard. He wrote every week from prison. His letters were no longer filled with frantic apologies, but with quiet reflections. He wrote about the books he was reading, the therapy sessions he was attending, and most of all about Hope. He asked about her favorite foods, her first words, her funny little habits. He was piecing together a picture of the daughter he was desperate to know to be worthy of. She opened the letter. It was short. Lottie, I learned today that my sentence is being reduced for good behavior. I'll be out in 6 months. I don't expect you to be waiting. I don't expect anything. I forfeited that right a long time ago. But I hope, one day, you will let me take my daughter to the park. I want to teach her how to swing. I want to be her father. I'm working every day to become a man who deserves that title. Yours, Richard. Charlotte folded the letter, a complex mix of emotions swirling within her. There was no going back to what they were, but perhaps there was a path forward to something new, a different kind of family forged in truth instead of lies. She looked at Hope, who was now laughing, her eyes bright with life. The whisper on the terrace from a brave young waiter had saved her from a gilded cage, but it was her daughter's first cry that had truly set her free. She had walked through the fire, and on the other side she had found not a fairy tale ending, but something far more valuable, a real beginning. Charlotte's story is a powerful reminder that the most perfect-looking lives can hide the most painful secrets. It shows us that true strength isn't about enduring mistreatment silently, but about finding the courage to listen to that small voice, whether it's from a stranger or from within, that tells you something is wrong. She dismantled an empire, not with rage, but with resolve, all to build a safe world for her daughter. Her journey from a humiliated wife to a powerful architect of her own destiny proves that it's never too late to rewrite your own story. If Charlotte's incredible story of courage and resilience touched you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who might need to hear a story of empowerment. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next real-life drama that will have you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for listening.